Welcome to The Debate. Today we're analyzing a truly seismic shift in global commercial policy. The administration has announced a sweeping new trade tax, a 10% baseline tariff on imports from almost all countries, and this is coupled with significantly higher rates on dozens of nations that are running large trade surpluses with the United States. The policy is vast and it is intentionally disruptive. So this brings us to a fundamental question. Does this use of broad, universal, and escalating tariffs, which are often defended as a move toward reciprocity, does it constitute a strategically justified and effective policy lever for rebalancing U.S. trade? Or is it in fact an economically arbitrary and detrimental action that risks harming domestic consumers and, well, global stability? I'll be making the case that this aggressive tariff strategy is a necessary tool for advancing vital national economic and fiscal interests, essentially for forcing other nations to the bargaining table.
And I'll be critiquing what I see as the flawed methodology behind the policy and analyzing its what I think are inevitable negative consequences for the U.S. economy.
So the premise behind this policy, it really is centered on correcting about a half-century of structural asymmetry. The U.S. market has for a long time been disproportionately open, allowing foreign goods relatively easy access, while many of our trading partners maintain pretty significant barriers. These new tariffs, the 10% universal baseline, and the increased rates, reaching 20% on the EU and 34% on China, they are fulfilling a core promise to rectify this. And this is fundamentally an exercise in leverage. The administration has explicitly stated that these levies are designed to, quote, give us great power to negotiate, basically coaxing countries to lower their own trade barriers to avoid these punitive costs. The U.S. is, for the first time in a while, putting itself in the driver's seat to demand genuine reciprocity. And crucially, we also have to recognize the immediate fiscal benefit. Customs duties collected last year were already approaching $80 billion. This policy is structured to sustain and increase that revenue stream, which provides a non-traditional way to generate money as an alternative to income tax revenue. And that's necessary to help finance the proposed extension of large expiring tax cuts. So this is a powerful, multifaceted mechanism of national interest.
I see the appeal of rebalancing trade, I do, but I have to disagree strongly that the sweeping policy qualifies as a strategic or reciprocal tool. To me, it feels more like an arbitrary hammer. The claim of reciprocity just immediately falls apart because the 10% baseline is imposed universally. This tax hits countries, indiscriminately. It doesn't matter if they have high tariffs, low tariffs, or even in some cases if they run a trade deficit with the U.S., we are imposing a penalty regardless of the behavior we claim we're targeting. And the economic consensus on this is unified and frankly pretty straightforward. Tariffs are a tax on domestic importers. Historical evidence consistently shows that this cost is rapidly passed on to the American consumer, and that leads directly to price inflation within a few months. We saw the risk confirmed instantly. Global markets reacted severely, and our largest trading partners, especially China, immediately announced equal dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs. And that means our exporters will also suffer. This sweeping, non-selective approach, it guarantees inflationary disruption across the entire economy without delivering the targeted strategic focus that, true industrial policy would require.
Well, that brings us directly to the central calculation, the methodology. I appreciate your point about the universal 10% tax, but let's focus on the Annex I countries for a moment, the ones with the high surplus that are facing those escalated rates. The administration insists that these higher rates are absolutely not arbitrary. They argue that the rates are justified by calculating not just the official WTO tariffs, but what they call combined trade barriers. And this includes a host of really complex factors: government subsidies, currency manipulation practices, and crucially, non-tariff barriers, or NTBs. So while the WTO might cite China's official tariff rate as low, the administration calculates China's total trade impediment to U.S. goods at 67% and India's at 52%. The resulting tariffs, like the 26% duty on India, are are specifically calibrated to charge roughly half of what the administration believes those countries are unfairly imposing, thereby rectifying these deep, long-standing structural imbalances that the official WTO figures just don't capture.
I understand the desire to account for barriers beyond, the simple customs schedules, but I have to challenge the premise that the administration has somehow managed to quantify currency manipulation and these incredibly complex non-tariff barriers when generations of trade economists have failed to do so robustly. Let's define NTBs clearly for our listeners. These are regulatory measures, things like complex licensing requirements or stringent food safety or environmental standards, technology certification rules. They aren't tariffs, but they still act as obstacles to trade. And they are incredibly difficult to measure because, frankly, many of them are just legitimate domestic regulations. So when the administration claims they've quantified China's total barriers at 67%, how did they get there? They didn't undertake a complex policy-by-policy analysis of NTBs.
We know they admitted to using a highly simplistic and I would say economically unsound proxy calculation.
What specifically do you mean by that proxy calculation? I understand you think it's flawed, but the goal was to establish a rough measure of reciprocity quickly.
And see, not economic science. They took the size of each country's trade imbalance on goods with the U.S., they divided that figure by the total amount America imports from that nation, and then they just halved the resulting percentage. That division gives you a proxy for how large that country's surplus is relative to its own ability to export to us, and then they have it to establish the tariff rate. Now let's look at the absurdity this creates. Because the calculation relies on a ratio involving imports, it leads to completely irrational outcomes for smaller trading partners. Take Lesotho, for example. The U.S. has a minimal trade imbalance with Lesotho, but we import essentially nothing from them. So when you divide a small imbalance by a near-zero import number, the resulting ratio just explodes.
The calculation yields a peak tariff rate of 50% on Lesotho, a country from which the U.S. imports a few $1 million worth of goods, simply because of a calculation quirk. This reveals the system is based on an arbitrary formula, not a genuine reflection of trade barriers or strategic intent.
I appreciate you highlighting the technical flaws in that edge case, but I would argue that focusing on a country like Lesotho distracts from the core strategic objective here, which is aimed at China, the EU, and other major surplus nations. The true measure of efficacy isn't the formula's perfection, it's the political outcome and the leverage achieved. The main goal is to compel major economic powers to the negotiating table. The president claimed this was already happening, noting that, quote, every country is calling us to try and negotiate a carve-out or a reduction. This policy immediately establishes a position of strength, forcing them to offer reciprocal reductions in their own foreign barriers if they want to access the lucrative U.S. market without these punitive costs.
That's a compelling claim about leverage. But how do you reconcile the fact that the administration itself offered two competing and frankly mutually exclusive justifications for this policy? To me, this reveals strategic confusion, not clarity. On one hand, you have the stated goal, a temporary negotiation tactic to reduce foreign barriers. The success condition there is reducing the cost to U.S. exporters. But on the other hand, a senior White House advisor called this policy a permanent national emergency that's intended to bring down the trade deficit by actively relocating production and manufacturing back to the U.S.
But those two goals aren't entirely contradictory. Forcing relocation or promoting domestic production is simply the necessary consequence if negotiation fails. It provides resilience to the U.S. economy, protecting domestic industries that have long suffered under this structural asymmetry. By raising the relative price of imported products, tariffs can promote U.S. infant industries and allow domestic producers to, potentially increase production and capture more of the market. It addresses a national goal.
The policy relies on generating massive tariff revenue, that $80 billion figure you mentioned, to help offset the projected $4.5 trillion cost of extending the 2017 tax cuts. Wait, how exactly does the administration justify using that $80 billion revenue projection if the policy is actually intended to eliminate the imports that generate that revenue? If the policy succeeds by either reducing overall imports or causing companies to relocate factories back to the U.S., that revenue stream collapses. You cannot simultaneously fund the tax cuts via customs duties and eliminate the goods being taxed. The trade objective, reducing imports, actively undercuts the fiscal objective of generating revenue. So what's the real goal?
I appreciate the distinction, and it does highlight a genuine tension. But the revenue stream serves as a necessary buffer during the transition period. The immediate gain ensures fiscal stability while the policy works to restructure supply chains. If domestic production increases, the long-term benefit of a more robust, self-sufficient economy and the resulting increased tax base from domestic profits will eventually offset the need for that import revenue.
You're prioritizing a near-term revenue projection over the long-term goal of industrial resilience. I'm just not convinced that economic resilience outweighs the immediate, guaranteed consumer cost. The primary worry among economists is that this sweeping tariff, applied indiscriminately to materials and finished goods globally, will result in an inflationary spiral. Furthermore, American consumers are already accustomed to rising prices following the recent inflationary spikes, meaning they may be more accepting of these tariff-induced price increases, which effectively makes the cost of this complex policy higher for all Americans. The burden is immediately socialized.
That line of reasoning, though, overlooks the legal authority and the administration's right to act decisively when facing a structural economic threat. The tariffs were imposed pursuant to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, of 1977. IEPA empowers the president to act to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy. Congress has historically delegated vast powers to the executive branch through several different laws to impose tariffs for specific circumstances, whether it's related to national security under Section 232 or specific industry harm. The use of IEPA here provides the necessary legal basis for swift, comprehensive action to deal with what they perceive as an acute threat to the nation's economic structure, a threat posed by these persistent trade deficits and this lack of reciprocity.
That's a powerful argument regarding the breadth of executive authority, but have you considered the legal contradiction inherent in using IIEPA for this specific purpose? IIEPA was designed for sudden, unexpected crises, true emergencies, and it has minimal guardrails compared to traditional trade laws. This is the first time it has been used to apply such sweeping tariffs based solely on the existence of generalized trade deficits. The fundamental mismatch is profound. The administration's own executive order establishing the policy notes that the underlying conditions being addressed, the large and persistent annual U.S. goods trade deficits, have been ongoing for more than 50 years. A decades-long structural phenomenon can hardly meet the legal requirement set forth in the act of being unusual or extraordinary.
But the threat is extraordinary, not because of its newness, but because of its sheer scale and persistence. When a structural imbalance threatens core domestic industries and national financial planning, decisive, comprehensive action is warranted. Using IEPA allows the executive to implement the policy without the cumbersome, slow process required by, say, Section 201 investigations.
But that cumbersome process is there for a reason. It ensures due process. By relying on an emergency authority that's meant for genuine crises, the administration completely sidesteps the traditional requirements found in other trade remedy statutes, things like public hearings, a determination of specific industry harm, and opportunities for importers and affected businesses to comment or seek exclusions. This policy is being applied globally and immediately, potentially disrupting hundreds of billions of dollars in trade based on a quick executive determination of a 50-year-old threat. That lack of due process, necessitated by using the wrong legal tool, it opens the door to significant legal challenges regarding the scope of executive power in trade policy.
The debate over these sweeping reciprocal tariffs, it really illuminates the necessary tension between traditional free trade ideology and the modern need for forceful policy tools to address these structural issues. The administration is utilizing broad executive authority based on a simple, forceful measure to reestablish reciprocity and secure specific national economic and fiscal objectives. This approach is designed to maximize negotiation leverage and, at the same time, generate significant, predictable revenue to fund other domestic priorities. While there are legitimate concerns about technical flaws and legal overreach, the policy represents a serious attempt to break from decades of asymmetrical trade relationships.
While I agree that the goals of rebalancing trade are understandable, the flaws in the execution are, to me,
too significant to ignore. The highly arbitrary nature of that proxy calculation, the reliance on the ill-fitting IEPA emergency authority, and the very high risk of immediate consumer price inflation across the board. It all suggests that this sweeping policy may be an inefficient and overly disruptive way to address genuinely complex structural imbalances. The fact remains that by applying a generalized tax rather than a targeted strategic tariff, the costs are borne disproportionately by consumers, and the benefits, whether trade concession or revenue generation, are placed in direct financial conflict with each other.
Ultimately, the long-term credibility of this maximalist approach to global trade will be determined by its results. Whether these aggressive policies force meaningful concessions from trading partners that actually open markets, or if they simply lead to prolonged economic disruption, trade wars, and, yes, high costs for American consumers. There is clearly much more to explore in how these policies will affect global supply chain restructuring in the coming months.